What if I told you that nearly everything you learned about Canadian history in school was either a comfortable lie, a convenient omission, or straight-up propaganda designed to make you feel good about living here? We're not talking about minor details or debatable interpretations. We're talking about foundational myths that shaped how you see this country. From peaceful colonization to the War of 1812, from Democratic Confederation to residential schools erased for generations. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to walk through 99 lies, myths, and deliberate distortions. These aren't minor details. These are constitutional frauds, cultural genocide, racist policies, and comfortable fiction designed to make you feel good about living here. So if you're enjoying this deep dive into the lies they taught you about Canada, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Get comfortable, maybe grab some water, and let's talk about the myths that fall apart the moment you look closely. Starting with the biggest lie of all, that Canada was peacefully settled. So here's the thing about Canadian history classes. They love to tell you that Canada was different from America, that while the United States had its violent westward expansion and Indian wars, Canada peacefully negotiated with Indigenous peoples and settled the land through cooperation and respect. This is a lie so fundamental, so deeply embedded in Canadian identity, that most Canadians get genuinely offended when you point out its complete fiction. The narrative goes something like this. The British and French came to Canada, met the Indigenous peoples, signed some treaties, maybe there were a few misunderstandings, but generally everyone got along and built a nation together. The Indigenous peoples welcomed the settlers, shared their knowledge of the land, and everything was very polite and Canadian. Except none of that is true, not even close. Let's start with the French colonization of New France, which is now Quebec and parts of the Maritimes. When Jacques Cartier arrived in 1534, he didn't find an empty wilderness waiting to be settled. He found the Iroquois Confederacy, a sophisticated political alliance that had existed for centuries. Cartier's first move was to plant a cross claiming the land for France, without bothering to ask the people who already lived there. The Iroquois chief Donnacona objected. Cartier kidnapped him and took him to France, where Donnacona died. That's your peaceful first contact. Kidnapping the local chief. The French settlement that followed involved decades of warfare. The Beaver Wars of the mid-1600s were a series of conflicts where the Iroquois, armed with Dutch and English guns, fought against the Huron, Algonquin, and French for control of the fur trade. Entire villages were destroyed. Thousands died. The Huron Confederacy was essentially destroyed as a political entity. French Jesuits wrote detailed accounts of these wars, describing torture, mass killings, and villages being burned. These accounts exist in historical records. They're just not in your high school textbooks. Then there's the British. Colonization. After the French were defeated in 1763, the British took over and immediately faced Indigenous resistance. Pontiac's War in 1763 and 1764 saw a confederation of Indigenous nations attack British forts across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. They captured 8 forts and killed thousands of settlers and soldiers. The British response included biological warfare. There are documented letters between British officers discussing giving smallpox-infected blankets to Indigenous peoples to spread disease. This isn't speculation. The letters exist. Colonel Henry Bouquet and General Jeffrey Amherst discussed it in writing. "We tried to kill you with smallpox blankets" is not typically included in the peaceful colonization narrative. Moving west, the Canadian Pacific Railway, which is taught as this great nation-building project that united Canada from sea to sea, was built through Indigenous territories without consent or compensation. The Blackfoot, Cree, and other nations whose land the railway crossed weren't asked permission. They were told the railway was coming and they could sign treaties accepting terrible terms, or they could be forcibly removed. That's not negotiation. That's extortion backed by the threat of military force. The numbered treaties, which Canada loves to point to as evidence of peaceful land sharing, were negotiated under coercion during periods of starvation. The buffalo herds that Plains Indigenous peoples depended on were deliberately destroyed. Some historians argue this was intentional policy to make Indigenous peoples dependent on government rations and thus more willing to sign treaties. Whether intentional or not, the result was the same. Indigenous peoples were starving, and the government said, "Sign this treaty and we'll give you food." That's not a fair negotiation. That's signing under duress. The Northwest Rebellion of 1885, which involved Métis and Indigenous peoples fighting against Canadian expansion, ended with the largest mass execution in Canadian history. 8 Indigenous men were hanged at Fort Battleford on November 27, 1885. This fact appears in some history books, but it's rarely emphasized. The event is framed as justice being served after a rebellion, not as the government executing Indigenous people who were defending their land. And speaking of deliberately omitted violence, let's talk about the War of 1812, which might be the most mythologized conflict in Canadian history. Canadians love to tell Americans that we burned down the White House. It's become a point of national pride. There are heritage minutes about it. It gets mentioned in arguments about Canadian toughness. Except it's not true. Canadians didn't burn the White House. British regulars did. Here's what actually happened. The War of 1812 was fought between the United States and Britain. Canada didn't exist as a country. It wouldn't exist for another 55 years. The territory that would become Canada was a collection of British colonies. When people talk about Canada burning the White House, they're referring to the burning of Washington in August 1814. The force that attacked Washington was composed of British Army regulars who had just arrived from Europe after fighting Napoleon. They weren't Canadian militia. They weren't settlers from Upper or Lower Canada. They were professional soldiers from Britain who sailed across the Atlantic specifically for this campaign. The commander was Major General Robert Ross, a British officer from Ireland. The troops were from British regiments that had fought in Spain and France. They landed in Maryland, marched to Washington, defeated American forces at the Battle of Bladensburg, then burned government buildings including the White House and the Capitol. After burning Washington, they sailed back to their ships and left. They didn't stay to defend Canadian territory. They were British forces conducting a British military operation. Now, there were certainly people from Canadian territories involved in the War of 1812. Canadian militia and Indigenous allies fought in numerous battles, particularly in the defense of Upper Canada. The battles at Queenston Heights, Lundy's Lane, and Beaver Dams involved Canadian militia. Indigenous warriors, particularly Tecumseh and his Confederacy, were crucial in the defense of Canadian territory. These were real contributions that deserve recognition, but they didn't burn Washington. That was the British. The reason this myth persists is that it gives Canadians a military victory to point to in their history. Canada's military history is actually quite significant. Canadians fought with distinction in both world wars, in Korea, and in peacekeeping operations around the world. But those are often seen as fighting under British or UN command. The War of 1812 offers a narrative where Canadians supposedly defeated Americans on their own soil. It's emotionally satisfying. It's just not accurate. The War of 1812 actually demonstrated how vulnerable Canadian territories were. American forces invaded and occupied parts of Upper Canada. York, which is now Toronto, was captured and burned by American forces in April 1813. The Americans burned the provincial parliament buildings. So if we're keeping score on capital burning, the Americans actually burned the Canadian colonial capital before the British burned Washington. That fact gets mentioned less often. The war ended essentially in a stalemate. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 restored pre-war boundaries. Nobody won. Both sides claimed victory, which is what happens when a war ends, inconclusively. But Canadian history teaches it as a defensive victory, with brave Canadian militia defending their homes against American aggression. The reality is more complicated. It was a British-American war, fought partly on Canadian territory, and the people living there suffered, regardless of who won specific battles. And speaking of Canadian mythology versus reality, let's talk about Confederation itself. The creation of Canada in 1867 is taught as this democratic moment where colonies came together and chose to form a nation. The reality is that Confederation was a backroom deal negotiated by colonial elites without any public consultation or vote. The average person living in British North America had no say in whether Confederation happened. The Charlottetown Conference in 1864 and the Quebec Conference later that year were invitation-only affairs. Colonial politicians met, negotiated the terms of Confederation, and decided the structure of the new country. There was no referendum, no public vote. The colonial legislatures voted on it, but these weren't democratic bodies in the modern sense. Voting rights were restricted to property-owning men. The vast majority of the population, including all women, all Indigenous peoples, and men without property, couldn't vote. In Nova Scotia, the public opposition to a confederation was so strong that when elections were finally held after Confederation was already imposed, anti-Confederation candidates won 36 of 38 seats in the provincial legislature. The people of Nova Scotia clearly didn't want to join Canada. They joined anyway because the colonial elite had already made the decision. This isn't a minor detail. This is the founding of the country happening against the expressed will of some of the people being forced into it. Newfoundland rejected Confederation in 1869 and remained separate until 1949. When Newfoundland finally joined Canada, it was after 2 referendums where the results were extremely close. The first referendum in 1948 had 3 options. Continuation of British rule won with 44.6%. Confederation with Canada got 41.1%. Independence got 14.3%. Since no option got over 50%, a second referendum was held with just 2 options. Confederation won with 52.3% to 47.7% for British rule. That's a majority of less than 5% for one of the most important decisions in Newfoundland's history. Nearly half the population voted against joining Canada, and they were overruled. The point here isn't that Confederation was necessarily a bad idea. The point is that it wasn't the democratic, consensual creation of a nation that history classes suggest. It was a political arrangement negotiated by elites and imposed on populations who often had no say and sometimes actively opposed it. That's a very different story than the one you were taught. This pattern of elite decision-making without public consultation characterized much of early Canadian governance. The rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada in 1837 and 1838 were partly about this issue. Reformers like William Lyon Mackenzie and Louis-Joseph Papineau were demanding responsible government, meaning governments accountable to elected assemblies rather than appointed colonial governors. The rebellions were crushed militarily. Hundreds were arrested. Some were executed. Others were exiled to Australia. The British response to democratic demands was violence and repression. Eventually, responsible government was granted in the 1840s, not because of democratic principles, but because the British realized it was cheaper and easier to let the colonies govern themselves in domestic matters, while Britain maintained control of foreign policy and defense. Democracy in Canada was granted reluctantly by colonial powers, not seized by the people through revolution, like in America or France. And speaking of things Canadians prefer not to examine too closely, let's talk about residential schools. For generations, Canadian history classes didn't mention them at all. Not a word. Students graduated high school without knowing that the Canadian government and churches forcibly removed over 150,000 Indigenous children from their families and placed them in institutions designed to eliminate their languages, cultures, and identities. This wasn't a minor policy. This was cultural genocide carried out over more than a century, and it was simply erased from the historical narrative taught in schools. The residential school system operated from the 1880s to 1996. That's not ancient history. The last residential school closed during the Clinton administration. There are people alive today who attended residential schools. There are people alive today who ran them. And for most of Canadian history, this system wasn't taught in schools. When it was mentioned at all, it was framed as misguided but well-intentioned efforts to educate Indigenous children. The reality was far darker. Children were forcibly taken from their families, sometimes by police. They were forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their cultures. They were given English or French names. Their hair was cut. They were punished, often physically, for any display of Indigenous identity. The schools were chronically underfunded. Children were malnourished. Disease was rampant. Thousands died. The death rate at some schools was higher than the death rate for Canadian soldiers during World War I. Let that sink in. Indigenous children at residential schools were more likely to die than soldiers in the trenches. Sexual abuse was widespread. Physical abuse was routine. Children were used as forced labor. Some schools conducted medical experiments on children without consent. There are documented cases of nutritional experiments where children were deliberately malnourished to study the effects of vitamin deficiencies. This happened in Canada in the 20th century. The goal of residential schools was explicitly cultural genocide. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, said the goal was to get rid of the Indian problem. He wanted to eliminate Indigenous peoples as distinct cultural groups. His policy was aggressive assimilation. Take the children away from their families, from their communities, from their cultures, and turn them into Canadians. That was official government policy. The long-term effects of residential schools are still visible today. Generations of Indigenous peoples grew up without their languages, without their cultural knowledge, and without learning how to parent because they were taken from their families as children. The trauma was passed down through generations. Residential schools are directly linked to the social problems facing many Indigenous communities today. High rates of addiction, mental health issues, family breakdown. You can't forcibly remove children for over a century and expect there to be no consequences. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated residential schools, concluded in 2015 that the system amounted to cultural genocide. This wasn't a fringe opinion. This was the conclusion of an official government commission after years of research and testimony from survivors. Cultural genocide happened in Canada, was perpetrated by the Canadian government and churches, and was hidden from Canadian history education for generations. Even today, many Canadians are only vaguely aware of residential schools. The myth of Canada as a tolerant, multicultural nation that treated Indigenous peoples better than America did is so deeply embedded that facts about residential schools get dismissed or minimized. People say things like, every country has dark chapters in their history, or it was a different time, as if systematic cultural genocide is comparable to normal historical mistakes, and as if being in the past somehow makes it less serious. And speaking of systematic oppression that gets minimized, let's talk about the Chinese head tax and exclusion laws. Canadian history classes mention that Chinese workers helped build the Canadian Pacific Railway. What they often don't emphasize is what happened to those workers afterward. Once the railway was complete in 1885, the Canadian government decided it didn't want Chinese immigrants anymore. So they passed the Chinese Immigration Act, which imposed a head tax of $50 on every Chinese immigrant. That's equivalent to about $1,500 today. The tax didn't stop Chinese immigration, so the government kept raising it. In 1900, it went up to $100. In 1903, it went up to $500, which is roughly $15,000 in today's money. This was deliberately designed to prevent Chinese families from immigrating. A laborer might be able to save enough to pay the tax for himself, but paying for a wife and children was financially impossible. The policy was explicitly racist. It didn't apply to European immigrants, only Chinese. Even the head tax wasn't enough for the Canadian government. In 1923, they passed the Chinese Immigration Act, commonly known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. It banned virtually all Chinese immigration to Canada. From 1923 to 1947, fewer than 50 Chinese immigrants were admitted to Canada. For 24 years, Canada had an explicitly racist immigration policy that banned people based on their ethnicity. This isn't ancient history. This law was in effect when your grandparents or great-grandparents might have been alive. The impact on Chinese Canadian communities was devastating. Men who had come to Canada to work couldn't bring their families. They couldn't go back to China and return because they wouldn't be allowed back in. These communities were almost entirely male because women couldn't immigrate. Families were separated for decades. Some men never saw their wives or children again. The Exclusion Act was finally repealed in 1947, but the damage had been done. The head tax and exclusion laws were explicit government policies based on white supremacy. The stated goal was to keep Canada white and British. This wasn't subtext. This was openly stated government policy, and it gets maybe a paragraph in most Canadian history textbooks, framed as an unfortunate mistake rather than as systematic racist oppression. Japanese Canadians faced similar treatment during World War II. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Canadian government classified all Japanese Canadians, even those born in Canada, as enemy aliens. About 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast. Their property was confiscated and sold. They were sent to internment camps in the interior of British Columbia or forced to work on farms in Alberta and Manitoba. This wasn't just first-generation immigrants from Japan. This included Canadian-born citizens whose families had been in Canada for generations. The conditions in the internment camps were harsh. Families lived in cramped, poorly heated shacks. They had minimal privacy and inadequate facilities. They were held there without trial, without any evidence of disloyalty, simply because of their ethnicity. Unlike in the United States, which at least allowed Japanese Americans to return to the West Coast after the war, Canada prohibited Japanese Canadians from returning until 1949. Even after the war ended, even after Japan surrendered, the Canadian government continued to forcibly disperse Japanese Canadian communities. Here's a detail that really highlights the injustice. The Canadian government sold the confiscated property of Japanese Canadians while they were in internment camps. Homes, businesses, fishing boats, all sold without the owner's consent and without fair compensation. When Japanese Canadians were finally allowed to return to the coast, their communities had been destroyed. Their property was gone. They had to start over from nothing. The government didn't apologize for this until 1988. That's 43 years after the war ended. The apology came with compensation of $21,000 per survivor, which doesn't begin to cover the losses. And this internment is often glossed over in Canadian history classes, mentioned briefly, if at all, and usually framed as a wartime security measure rather than as racist policy that destroyed communities and violated civil rights. And speaking of violations of civil rights during wartime, let's talk about conscription crises, which reveal deep divisions in Canadian society. During World War I, Canada initially relied on voluntary enlistment, but by 1917, casualties were mounting and volunteers weren't enough to maintain troop strength. Prime Minister Robert Borden introduced conscription mandatory military service. This was deeply unpopular in Quebec, where many French Canadians saw it as an English-Canadian war that had nothing to do with them. The conscription crisis of 1917 nearly tore the country apart. French Canadian nationalists opposed conscription. Riots broke out in Quebec City at Easter 1918. Federal troops were sent to suppress the riots. Soldiers fired on civilians. 5 people were killed. Dozens were wounded. This was the Canadian military shooting Canadian civilians over conscription policy. That's not the kind of national unity story that makes it into history classes. The conscription crisis created lasting resentment between English and French Canada. It reinforced the perception among French Canadians that Canada was an English country that didn't respect French Canadian interests. The Liberal Party, which had opposed conscription, dominated Quebec politics for generations, partly because of this issue. The political divisions from 1917 shaped Canadian politics for decades. World War II saw another conscription crisis. Prime Minister Mackenzie King tried to avoid it by promising not to impose conscription for overseas service. He held a referendum in 1942 asking if the government could be released from this promise. The results split along linguistic lines. English Canada voted yes, Quebec voted no. King eventually imposed limited conscription in 1944, but the damage to national unity was done. Again, French Canadians felt their wishes were ignored by English Canadian majority. These conscription crises are taught in Canadian schools, but they're often framed as political debates rather than as moments when the country almost fractured along linguistic lines. The violence in Quebec City in 1918 gets minimal attention. The deep resentment and the sense of betrayal felt by French Canadians gets acknowledged but not really explored. The narrative focuses on Canada's military contributions to both world wars, which were significant, but glosses over the internal conflicts about whether Canada should be fighting at all. And speaking of internal conflicts that get glossed over, let's talk about the October Crisis of 1970, which was the only time in Canadian peacetime history that the War Measures Act was invoked. In October 1970, the Front de Libération du Québec, a militant Quebec separatist group, kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross and Quebec Cabinet Minister Pierre Laporte. The FLQ wanted Quebec independence and was willing to use violence to achieve it. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, which suspended civil liberties across Canada. Police could arrest and detain people without charges. Freedom of assembly was suspended. Hundreds of people were arrested, most of whom had nothing to do with the FLQ. They were artists, intellectuals, union organizers, and activists who supported Quebec. Independence, but not violence. They were arrested without warrants, held without charges, and interrogated. Pierre Laporte was murdered by his kidnappers. James Cross was eventually released after negotiations. The kidnappers were allowed to flee to Cuba. The crisis ended, but the use of the War Measures Act remained controversial. Civil liberties were suspended across the entire country, not just in Quebec and not just in Montreal where the kidnappings occurred. The whole country was under emergency powers because of a small terrorist group. Trudeau famously said, "Just watch me," when asked how far he would go. He went far enough to suspend civil liberties and arrest hundreds of people without charges. Many Canadians supported this at the time. They were scared and wanted the government to act decisively. But in retrospect, the use of the War Measures Act for a kidnapping, even a political kidnapping, seems like massive overreach. The October crisis is taught in Canadian schools, but the focus is usually on the FLQ terrorism and Trudeau's leadership. The suspension of civil liberties gets mentioned, but rarely examined in depth. The fact that hundreds of innocent people were arrested and detained without charges is acknowledged but not really grappled with. The narrative is about Trudeau being tough and decisive, not about whether suspending civil liberties across an entire country was a proportionate response to a localized terrorist incident. And speaking of Quebec and national unity, let's talk about the two Quebec referendums on independence. In 1980, and again in 1995, Quebec held referendums on whether to pursue sovereignty. Both times the no side won, meaning Quebec remained in Canada. But the second referendum in 1995 was terrifyingly close. The no side won by less than 1%. If 54,288 people had voted differently, Quebec would have voted to leave Canada. Think about that for a moment. In 1995, Canada came within 1% of losing its second most populous province. The country nearly fractured. And this wasn't some ancient historical near miss. This was during the Seinfeld and Friends era. This was when people had cell phones and email. Modern Canada almost split apart. The 1995 referendum campaign was bitter and divisive. The federal government and English Canadian politicians campaigned aggressively for the no side. There were accusations of dirty tricks, of federal money being funneled into the no campaign illegally, of the referendum question being deliberately confusing. The Quebec government wanted a clear question about sovereignty. The federal government wanted a muddled question that mentioned partnership with Canada to make sovereignty sound less scary. On referendum night, as results came in, it became clear the vote would be extremely close. When the final results showed the no side winning by 50.58% to 49.42%, there was relief among Federalists and devastation among sovereigntists. Quebec Premier Jacques Parizeau gave a bitter concession speech where he blamed money and the ethnic vote for the loss, a comment that was widely criticized as xenophobic. The aftermath of the 1995 referendum included soul-searching about Canadian unity. The federal government passed the Clarity Act in 2000, which set conditions for any future referendum on secession. Quebec nationalists saw this as English Canada imposing rules on Quebec's right to self-determination. Federalists saw it as necessary protection against a clear referendum question being used to destroy the country. The referendums revealed deep divisions in Canadian society. Many English Canadians didn't understand why Quebec would want to leave. Many Quebecers felt English Canada didn't understand or respect their distinct identity. The issue hasn't gone away. Support for Quebec's sovereignty has declined since 1995, but it hasn't disappeared. The question of Quebec's place in Canada remains unresolved. Canadian history classes teach about the referendums, but often with a sense of relief that they failed rather than serious examination of why they happened and what they revealed about Canadian unity. The narrative is that Canada stayed together, which is good, without really grappling with the fact that nearly half of Quebec voters wanted to leave. That's not a small discontented minority. That's nearly half the province. And speaking of uncomfortable truths about Canadian identity, let's talk about the myth of Canadian multiculturalism and tolerance. Canada likes to present itself as a multicultural mosaic, unlike the American melting pot. The story is that Canada celebrates diversity, that different cultures are welcomed and respected, and that Canada has always been more tolerant than other countries. This is partly true, but also partly myth that obscures a more complicated reality. Canada's official multiculturalism policy wasn't adopted until 1971. Before that, Canadian immigration policy was explicitly racist, designed to keep Canada white and British. The Chinese Exclusion Act has already been mentioned, but there were also policies restricting immigration from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from anywhere that wasn't white and European. The Komagata Maru incident in 1914 perfectly illustrates Canadian racism at the time. A ship carrying 376 passengers, mostly Sikhs from India, arrived in Vancouver. They were British subjects. India was part of the British Empire. They had every legal right to enter Canada, but Canadian immigration officials refused to let them land. The ship sat in Vancouver Harbor for 2 months while passengers were denied entry. Eventually, the ship was forced to leave. When it returned to India, British colonial authorities suspected the passengers of sedition. A riot broke out when police tried to arrest them. 19 passengers were killed. Canada denied entry to British subjects because they were brown. The passengers had followed all legal requirements. They had documentation. They had money. But they weren't white, so they were turned away. This isn't a minor footnote. This is official government policy based on white supremacy. Even after World War II, Canadian immigration policy remained discriminatory. The preferred immigrants were from Britain and Western Europe. Southern and Eastern Europeans were acceptable but less desirable. Anyone who wasn't white faced significant barriers. This didn't change until the 1960s when the points-based immigration system was introduced, removing explicitly racial criteria. The multicultural Canada that exists today is relatively recent. It's the result of policy changes in the 1960s and 70s, not some long-standing Canadian tradition. And even today, despite official multiculturalism, racism remains a significant problem in Canada. Indigenous peoples face ongoing discrimination. Black Canadians experience racism regularly. Asian Canadians have been targeted with racist attacks, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. The myth of Canadian tolerance also obscures historical anti-Semitism. In the 1930s and 40s, when Jews were fleeing Nazi persecution in Europe, Canada's immigration policy toward Jewish refugees was summed up as "none is too many." That's a quote from an immigration official when asked how many Jewish refugees Canada would accept. From 1933 to 1945, Canada accepted fewer than 5,000 Jewish refugees, one of the worst records of any Western country. The MS St. Louis incident in 1939 is particularly shameful. A ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees from Germany was turned away from Cuba and the United States. It sailed to Canada seeking refuge. The Canadian government refused. The ship returned to Europe. About a quarter of the passengers were killed in the Holocaust. Canada could have saved them. We chose not to because of anti-Semitism. This history of discrimination, of racist immigration policies, of turning away refugees, doesn't fit the multicultural tolerance narrative, so it gets minimized or framed as unfortunate mistakes of the past. But these weren't mistakes. These were deliberate policies based on racism and xenophobia, and they shaped Canada's development as a nation. The comfortable myth is that Canada has always been welcoming and tolerant. The reality is that Canada has often been racist and exclusionary, and only relatively recently adopted policies that support actual multiculturalism. That's a very different story, and it's one that most Canadian history classes don't tell, and we're just getting started with the lies they taught you. And speaking of myths about Canadian identity, let's talk about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP is one of Canada's most recognizable symbols. The Mounties in their red serge uniforms represent Canadian law and order around the world. They're depicted as heroic, honorable, always getting their man. The reality of the RCMP's history, particularly in relation to Indigenous peoples, is far less heroic. The Northwest Mounted Police, which became the RCMP, was created in 1873 specifically to control Indigenous peoples and Métis in the Western Territories. The force's first major action was to suppress the whiskey trade, which sounds noble until you realize this was about asserting Canadian government authority over Indigenous territories, not about protecting Indigenous peoples. The NWMP facilitated the signing of numbered treaties by providing the government presence that made resistance seem futile. They enforced laws that restricted Indigenous peoples to reserves. They arrested Indigenous people who left reserves without passes. During the 1885 Northwest Rebellion, the NWMP fought against Métis and Indigenous forces defending their land. After the rebellion, the NWMP arrested hundreds of Indigenous people. They were present at the mass execution at Fort Battleford. They enforced the pass system, which required Indigenous peoples to get permission from Indian agents to leave their reserves. This system had no basis in law. Treaties didn't mention it. Parliament never authorized it. But the NWMP enforced it anyway for decades, restricting Indigenous peoples' freedom of movement based on nothing but administrative policy. The RCMP's role in enforcing residential school attendance is particularly dark. Mounties would go to reserves and forcibly remove children from their families to take them to residential schools. Parents who resisted could be arrested. Children who ran away from schools were hunted down by RCMP and returned. The RCMP were the enforcement arm of cultural genocide. In more recent history, the RCMP has been involved in numerous scandals. The Oka crisis in 1990 saw RCMP and Sûreté du Québec officers in a standoff with Mohawk protesters. A Quebec police officer was killed in a firefight. The military was called in. The crisis lasted 78 days. It started because the town of Oka wanted to expand a golf course onto Mohawk burial grounds. Think about that. A golf course expansion led to an armed standoff that required military intervention. The Ipperwash crisis in 1995 saw Ontario Provincial Police, not RCMP, but similar issues, storm a provincial park that had been occupied by Indigenous protesters. Dudley George, an unarmed protester, was shot and killed by police. The protesters were occupying the park because it had been taken from their community during World War II, with a promise it would be returned after the war. It never was. When they occupied it to press their claim, they were met with police violence. The RCMP's actions during pipeline protests in recent years have also been controversial. During protests against the Coastal GasLink pipeline in Wet'suwet'en Territory in 2020, RCMP officers in tactical gear raided camps, arrested protesters, and enforced court injunctions. The protesters argued they had the right to block the pipeline because it crossed unceded territory without consent from hereditary chiefs. The RCMP enforced Canadian law, but the question of whose law applies on unceded Indigenous territory remains contested. The RCMP's treatment of Indigenous women has been particularly problematic. Indigenous women are overrepresented among missing and murdered women in Canada. The RCMP's investigations of these cases have often been inadequate. There are documented cases of RCMP officers taking Indigenous women to remote locations and abandoning them, sometimes in winter. This practice, known as starlight tours, has resulted in deaths. Officers have been convicted in some cases, but the practice was more widespread than official records suggest. The squeaky clean image of the Mounties always getting their man doesn't include the context that often the man they got was Indigenous and defending his land, or that the woman they didn't get was Indigenous and the investigation was cursory at best. The RCMP's history is complicated and often troubling, but Canadian mythology prefers the red surge and the musical ride. And speaking of things Canadian history overlooks, let's talk about the internment of Ukrainians during World War I. Everyone knows about Japanese internment during World War II. Almost nobody knows that Canada interned thousands of Ukrainian Canadians during World War I. Between 1914 and 1920, about 8,579 people, mostly Ukrainian Canadians, were interned as enemy aliens. Thousands more had to register with authorities and report regularly. The interned were not enemy combatants. They were immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was at war with Britain and therefore with Canada. Many were recent immigrants who had come to Canada to homestead or work. They were imprisoned in camps across Canada, forced to work on infrastructure projects, logging, mining, and building roads. They weren't paid for this labor or were paid far below normal wages. This was forced labor. The conditions in the camps were harsh. Families were separated. People died from disease and accidents. The internment continued even after World War I ended in 1918. Some people remained interned until 1920. Their property was often confiscated. After release, many faced ongoing discrimination and economic hardship. This internment was based on ethnicity and nationality, not on any evidence of disloyalty or threat. It was sanctioned by the War Measures Act, the same act used during the October crisis in 1970. The act gave the government sweeping powers to detain people without trial, and it was used to imprison thousands of Ukrainian Canadians whose only crime was being from the wrong country. The Canadian government didn't officially acknowledge this internment until 2005. That's 85 years after the last internment camps closed. There was no compensation for survivors or descendants. There was a symbolic payment to commemorate the injustice and fund educational initiatives, but nothing approaching the compensation given to Japanese Canadians. The Ukrainian internment is still largely unknown to most Canadians. It doesn't fit the narrative of Canada as welcoming to immigrants and refugees. And speaking of narratives about Canadian tolerance, let's talk about segregation in Canada. When Canadians learn about segregation, it's always about the American South. Jim Crow laws, separate water fountains, Rosa Parks, the civil rights movement. The impression is that segregation was an American problem. Canada didn't have that, except Canada absolutely had segregation. In Nova Scotia, there were segregated schools for black students until the 1960s. Africville, a black community in Halifax, was demolished in the 1960s. Residents were forcibly relocated. The city claimed it was a slum clearance project, but the community had been deliberately denied city services like water, sewage, and paved roads for decades. Then the city used the lack of those services as justification to demolish it. The land was turned into industrial use and a park. The destruction of Africville was cultural genocide of a black community. Movie theaters, restaurants, and other businesses across Canada had policies excluding black Canadians. In 1946, Viola Desmond, a black businesswoman in Nova Scotia, was arrested for sitting in the whites-only section of a movie theater in New Glasgow. She hadn't known about the segregation policy. When told to move, she refused. She was forcibly removed, arrested, and convicted of defrauding the government of 1 cent in tax. The charge was based on the fact that the main floor tickets cost 1 cent more tax than the balcony tickets, where black patrons were forced to sit. Desmond appealed her conviction and lost. The courts upheld segregation. This was 1946, a year after World War II ended, a war supposedly fought against racism and tyranny. Canada sent soldiers to fight Nazis while maintaining segregation at home. Desmond's conviction wasn't overturned until 2010, 64 years after the fact. She died in 1965 without seeing justice. Residential segregation was common across Canada. Many neighborhoods had restrictive covenants preventing sale of property. To Jews, blacks, Asians, or other non-white groups, these covenants were legal and enforced by courts until the 1950s. The beach area in Toronto had signs posted saying, "No Jews, no dogs." This was in Canada. In the 20th century, Indigenous peoples faced segregation as well. Many businesses refused to serve Indigenous customers. Some towns had informal policies excluding Indigenous peoples from certain areas. The pass system kept Indigenous peoples confined to reserves. When they did leave reserves, they faced discrimination in housing, employment, and public services. Canadian segregation wasn't identical to American segregation. It wasn't codified in laws the same way. It was often informal, based on custom and discrimination rather than explicit legal mandate. But the effect was the same. People were excluded, marginalized, and denied rights based on their race. Pretending this didn't happen, or that it was less serious because it wasn't written into law the way American Jim Crow was, is just another comfortable lie. And speaking of comfortable lies, let's talk about Canadian contributions to space exploration. Canadians love to brag about the Canadarm, the robotic arm used on space shuttles, and the International Space Station. It's presented as a major Canadian achievement in space technology, and it is an achievement. Canadian engineers designed and built a useful piece of equipment that NASA used for decades. But the way it's taught suggests Canada is a major player in space exploration, which is overstated. The Canadarm was built by a Canadian company, but the space program it served was American. Canada didn't have its own space program in any meaningful sense. Canada had aerospace engineers who did good work, but they did that work for American and international projects. Canada's space agency, the Canadian Space Agency, wasn't created until 1989. Its budget is a tiny fraction of NASA's budget. Canadian astronauts have flown in space, but always on American or Russian spacecraft. Marc Garneau was the first Canadian in space in 1984. Chris Hadfield became famous for singing David Bowie's Space Oddity aboard the ISS. Juliette Payette became Governor General after her astronaut career. These are accomplished people who did impressive things, but they did them as part of American or international programs, not Canadian ones. The mythology around the Canadarm inflates Canada's role in space exploration. It's taught as if Canada is NASA's equal partner in space. The reality is that Canada has contributed useful technology and capable people to space programs run by other countries. That's not nothing, but it's not the same as being a major spacefaring nation. This pattern of inflating Canadian contributions appears in other areas too. Canadians are taught that Canada invented basketball, hockey, and other sports. James Naismith, who invented basketball, was Canadian-born, but invented the game in Massachusetts while working at a YMCA in Springfield. Does that make basketball a Canadian invention? It's debatable. Similarly, hockey's origins are disputed. Games resembling hockey were played in various forms across Canada and northern United States. Canada didn't invent hockey so much as hockey evolved from various stick and ball games and Canadians were among those playing and developing it. The myth serves a purpose. It gives Canadians things to be proud of. But it also creates a distorted view of Canadian achievements. Canada has real accomplishments. Canadians have done impressive things. But mythologizing and inflating those accomplishments doesn't serve anyone well. It creates unrealistic expectations and prevents honest assessment of Canada's actual role in world events. And speaking of mythologized Canadian achievements, let's talk about universal health care. Canadians are incredibly proud of their healthcare system. It's seen as one of the defining features of Canadian identity, proof that Canada is more compassionate and civilized than the United States. The story taught in schools is that Tommy Douglas, Premier of Saskatchewan, introduced universal health care in Saskatchewan in the 1960s, and it spread across Canada, creating the system that exists today. That's broadly true, but it omits important context. The introduction of Medicare in Saskatchewan in 1962 was fiercely opposed by doctors. Saskatchewan doctors went on strike for 23 days. They claimed government health care would destroy medical practice. They were supported by the American Medical Association, which feared Canadian Medicare would inspire similar programs in the United States. The strike was bitter and divisive. Eventually, the government and doctors reached a compromise, and Medicare was implemented. When Canada adopted national Medicare in the late 1960s under Prime Minister Lester Pearson, it was also controversial. It wasn't a universally popular decision embraced by all Canadians. It was a political battle, and the system that emerged wasn't the comprehensive, universal system that many people imagine. Canadian Medicare covers doctor visits and hospital stays. It doesn't cover prescription drugs, dental care, vision care, or many other health services. Canadians pay for those out of pocket or through private insurance. The system varies by province. Some provinces cover more than others. There are long wait times for many procedures. The system is under constant financial pressure. The mythology around Canadian healthcare is that it's completely free and covers everything. The reality is more complicated. It's government-funded healthcare for certain services, with significant gaps. It's better than the American system in many ways, particularly in ensuring everyone has access to basic care. But it's not the utopian system that Canadian mythology suggests. The other myth is that Tommy Douglas single-handedly created Canadian healthcare. Douglas was important. His government in Saskatchewan pioneered provincial healthcare. But he didn't work alone. There were healthcare advocates, doctors who supported reform, public health officials, and political allies who made it happen. And the federal adoption of Medicare wasn't just because of Douglas. It was because of political pressure, changing public opinion, and the work of many people across Canada. Giving all credit to Douglas creates a great man theory of history where one heroic individual changes everything. The reality is that social change happens through the work of many people, through political movements, through changing circumstances and opportunities. Douglas deserves credit, but so do many others whose names aren't remembered. And speaking of great man myths, let's talk about the Avro Arrow. The CF-105 Avro Arrow was a supersonic interceptor aircraft developed by Avro Canada in the 1950s. It was cancelled by the Diefenbacher government in 1959. The cancellation has been mythologized as one of the greatest mistakes in Canadian history, a moment when Canada gave up its chance to be a leader in aerospace technology. The mythology goes like this. The Arrow was the most advanced aircraft in the world. It was cancelled because of American pressure or because the government was short-sighted. The cancellation destroyed Canada's aerospace industry. If only the Arrow had been allowed to continue, Canada would be a major aerospace power today. The reality is more complicated. The Arrow was an impressive aircraft. It was advanced for its time, but it was also extremely expensive. The program was over budget and behind schedule. The original plan was to build hundreds of Arrows. By the time of cancellation, that had been reduced to maybe 100. The per-unit cost was becoming prohibitive. More importantly, the strategic situation was changing. The Arrow was designed as an interceptor to shoot down Soviet bombers. By the late 1950s, the threat was shifting to intercontinental ballistic missiles. You can't intercept a ballistic missile with a fighter jet. The Arrow's mission was becoming obsolete before it entered service. The Diefenbaker government decided to cancel the Arrow and buy American missiles instead. This was probably the right decision strategically, even if it was devastating to the Canadian aerospace industry. The missiles were cheaper and more effective against the actual threat Canada faced. The cancellation was handled badly. About 14,000 people lost their jobs. The existing Arrow aircraft were ordered destroyed, cut up for scrap. This destruction seems spiteful in retrospect. The aircraft could have been preserved for museums or testing, but the government wanted to ensure the program was completely ended and that no one could restart it. Many of the engineers who had worked on the Arrow moved to the United States and worked for NASA and American aerospace companies. Some of them contributed to the Apollo program. This brain drain was a real loss for Canada, but the idea that the Arrow's cancellation destroyed Canadian aerospace is overstated. Canada still has an aerospace industry. It's smaller than it might have been, but it exists. The Arrow mythology serves as a national tragedy story. It's a moment when Canada could have been great but failed. It feeds into Canadian insecurity about being overshadowed by the United States, and it absolves Canadians of the need to examine why the aerospace industry didn't recover, why Canadian governments haven't invested more in advanced technology, why Canada remains dependent on other countries for military equipment. And speaking of Canadian identity and insecurity, let's talk about the adoption of the Canadian flag in 1965. The current maple leaf flag is now universally recognized as Canada's symbol, but its adoption was intensely controversial. Before 1965, Canada's flag was the red ensign, which featured the Union Jack and the Canadian coat of arms. Many Canadians, particularly English Canadians and veterans, were deeply attached to the red ensign and to the British connection it represented. Prime Minister Lester Pearson wanted a new flag that didn't feature British symbols. He wanted a distinctly Canadian flag that both English and French Canadians could embrace. The debate over the new flag was bitter. It lasted for months. Parliament debated it endlessly. John Diefenbaker, the Conservative leader, opposed changing the flag. He saw it as abandoning Canada's British heritage. The debate revealed deep divisions about Canadian identity. Was Canada British? Was it bicultural English and French? Was it something new and distinct? These weren't abstract questions. They were about fundamental identity and belonging. Eventually, the current flag design, with the stylized red maple leaf on white with red bars, was chosen. It was a compromise. It didn't include British symbols, which pleased French Canadians and those wanting a distinct Canadian identity. But it wasn't radical. It used traditional Canadian colors and a recognizable Canadian symbol. The flag was officially adopted on February 15th, 1965. The backlash was significant. Veterans groups protested. Some people refused to fly the new flag. There were predictions that the new flag would never be accepted, but within a few years, the maple leaf flag became widely accepted. Today, it's hard to imagine Canada with any other flag. What history classes don't emphasize is how recent this symbol is and how controversial it was. Canada didn't have its current flag until 1965. People alive today remember when Canada had a different flag. The national symbol that seems eternal and uncontroversial is actually relatively new and was adopted over significant opposition. This pattern repeats throughout Canadian history. Things that seem fundamental and unchanging are actually recent. Canada as a fully independent country is debatable even now. The British monarch is still Canada's head of state. The UK Parliament's authority over Canada wasn't completely ended until the Constitution Act of 1982. Canada couldn't amend its own constitution without British approval until 1982. That's the year E.T. was in theaters. Canada achieved full constitutional independence the same year Michael Jackson released Thriller. And speaking of Canada's relationship with Britain, let's talk about the Suez Crisis of 1956, which is taught as Lester Pearson's greatest achievement. The story goes like this. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt after Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The world was on the brink of war. Pearson, Canada's foreign minister, proposed a United Nations peacekeeping force to separate the combatants and allow Britain and France to withdraw without losing face. The UN adopted the plan. Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize. Canadian peacekeeping was born. That's all true, but it omits important context. Britain and France invaded Egypt in a colonial war trying to maintain control over a strategic asset. It was imperialism. Pearson's peacekeeping plan did help end the crisis, but it also helped Britain and France avoid complete humiliation. The peacekeepers allowed them to withdraw while claiming they were supporting international peace, not admitting defeat. Canada's role in the Suez Crisis is presented as neutral peacekeeping, but Canada was arguably helping colonial powers save face after an unjustified invasion. Egypt didn't want Canadian peacekeepers initially because the Canadian Army wore British-style uniforms and had a British regimental structure. From Egypt's perspective, Canadians looked like British soldiers. They weren't neutral, they were Britain's cousins. Pearson did deserve credit for creative diplomacy. The peacekeeping concept was innovative, but the mythology around Suez erases the colonial context and presents Canada as a purely neutral, honest broker. The reality was messier. Canada was caught between its British heritage and its desire for independent foreign policy. Pearson threaded that needle successfully, but it wasn't simple peacekeeping. It was complicated diplomacy serving multiple agendas. The broader myth is that Canada is a peacekeeping nation. Canada did contribute to many UN peacekeeping missions during the Cold War, but Canada also participated in wars. Canada fought in Korea. Canada contributed to NATO. Canadian forces have been involved in combat missions in Afghanistan and elsewhere. The peacekeeping identity is part of Canadian mythology, but it's not the whole story. And speaking of myths about Canadian military history, let's talk about Vimy Ridge. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917 during World War I is taught as the moment Canada became a nation. The Canadian Corps, all 4 divisions fighting together for the first time, captured Vimy Ridge from German forces. It was a genuine military success. The battle is commemorated with an impressive memorial in France. The mythology around Vimy is that it was the birth of Canada as a nation, the moment Canadians stopped being colonials and became a distinct people. This makes for inspiring storytelling, but it's historically questionable. Canada had been a country since 1867, 50 years before Vimy Ridge. The idea that Canada wasn't really a nation until its soldiers captured a ridge in France is odd when you think about it. Vimy was important. It was a well-planned battle where Canadians showed effective tactics and coordination. But it wasn't unique. Other armies were also learning and adapting. Canadian forces fought well at Vimy, but they also fought well at other battles that aren't mythologized the same way. The Vimy myth serves the purpose of giving Canada a founding military moment, a moment where Canadians proved themselves in battle and earned respect. It's similar to how Americans view Valley Forge or Gettysburg. These battles become mythological moments that define national character, but focusing on Vimy erases other parts of World War I history. It erases the conscription crisis. It erases the fact that many Canadians, particularly French Canadians, didn't want to fight in a European war. It erases the costs. Over 60,000 Canadians died in World War I. Many more were wounded. Entire communities lost their young men. The war devastated a generation. The Vimy mythology presents World War I as a coming-of-age moment for Canada. An alternative view is that Canada sent tens of thousands of men to die in a European imperial war that had nothing to do with Canadian interests. Both views have truth to them, but Canadian history education emphasizes the former and downplays the latter. And speaking of World War I, let's talk about the Halifax explosion, which is taught but often with sanitized details. On December 6, 1917, two ships collided in Halifax Harbor. One ship, the Mont Blanc, was loaded with explosives bound for Europe. The collision caused a fire. About 20 minutes later, the Mont Blanc exploded. The explosion was the largest human-made explosion before nuclear weapons. It devastated Halifax, killing about 2,000 people immediately and injuring 9,000 more. The explosion flattened buildings for miles. It created a tsunami that washed over the harbor. Glass windows shattered across Halifax, which is why so many injuries involve glass, cuts, and blindness. A Halifax blizzard hit the next day, making rescue efforts even more difficult. What history classes often omit is the aftermath and the blame. The initial response was to blame the captain of the Mont Blanc, who was French. There was anti-French sentiment. The investigation eventually determined that both ships shared blame for the collision. But the rush to blame the French captain reflected ethnic tensions. The explosion also revealed class divisions in Halifax. The wealthy south end of the city was largely undamaged. The working-class north end was destroyed. The neighborhoods near the harbor, where workers and their families lived, bore the brunt of the disaster. The reconstruction efforts were complicated by these class divisions. The Halifax explosion is remembered as a tragedy, which it was, but the social and political context around it gets less attention, and that pattern repeats throughout Canadian history. Disasters are remembered. The inequality and social tensions they revealed are forgotten. And speaking of things that get forgotten, let's talk about when Indigenous peoples actually got the right to vote in Canada. Most Canadians assume Indigenous peoples always had the right to vote, or at least got it around the same time as other Canadians. The reality is shockingly recent. Status Indians, as they were legally called, didn't get the federal vote without conditions until 1960. 1960, that's the year John F. Kennedy was elected president. Indigenous peoples in Canada couldn't vote in federal elections until the same year the Flintstones premiered on television. Before 1960, Indigenous peoples could only vote if they gave up their Indian status through a process called enfranchisement. Enfranchisement meant renouncing your legal identity as an Indigenous person, giving up treaty rights, and being removed from band membership. You had to choose between being Indigenous or being a citizen with voting rights. This wasn't just a bureaucratic technicality. Enfranchisement meant cutting ties with your community, your culture, your legal rights. Very few Indigenous peoples chose enfranchisement because the cost was too high. The enfranchisement system was designed to gradually eliminate Indigenous peoples as distinct groups. The government's explicit policy was to make Indigenous peoples disappear through assimilation. Every Indigenous person who enfranchised was one less Indian from the government's perspective. The fact that voting rights required this proves the government saw Indigenous identity as incompatible with Canadian citizenship. Provincial voting rights came even later in some cases. In Quebec, Indigenous peoples couldn't vote provincially until 1969. Think about that. People in Quebec were watching the moon landing on television, while Indigenous peoples in their province still couldn't vote in provincial elections. This wasn't ancient history. This was during the hippie era, during Woodstock, during the Summer of Love. The delayed voting rights reveal Canada's fundamental view of Indigenous peoples. They weren't considered full citizens. They were wards of the state, under government control, without basic democratic rights. And this is rarely emphasized in history classes. The narrative is that Canada extended citizenship and rights to Indigenous peoples. The reality is that rights were deliberately withheld for generations and only granted reluctantly. And speaking of rights being withheld, let's talk about the 60s scoop, which happened parallel to residential schools but gets even less attention. From the 1960s through the 1980s, child welfare authorities removed thousands of Indigenous children from their families and placed them for adoption with non-Indigenous families. This happened across Canada, but was particularly widespread in provinces like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The 60s scoop wasn't based on widespread abuse or neglect. It was based on cultural bias. Social workers, almost all of whom were white, judged Indigenous families by middle-class white standards. A family living in poverty, or living traditionally, or simply living differently from white Canadian norms, was deemed unfit. Children were apprehended and adopted out, often without parents' informed consent. Many children were adopted into American families. They grew up not knowing they were Indigenous, not knowing their birth families, not knowing their cultures or languages. When they tried to reconnect as adults, they often faced bureaucratic obstacles. Records were sealed. Information was withheld. Some discovered they had siblings who had also been adopted to different families. Entire families were scattered across North America. The 60s scoop was cultural genocide continuing after residential schools began closing. The method changed from boarding schools to adoption, but the goal remained the same: eliminate Indigenous cultures by removing children. And like residential schools, the 60s scoop wasn't taught in Canadian schools for decades. It was happening while baby boomers were in school and they weren't taught about it. It was happening while Generation X was in school and they weren't taught about it. Only recently has it entered mainstream historical awareness. The apologies and settlements for the 60s scoop didn't begin until the 2000s. Survivors spent decades seeking recognition and compensation. Some provincial governments apologized. The federal government apologized in 2017. But thousands of people spent their lives disconnected from their families and cultures because of government policy. And for most of Canadian history, nobody talked about it. And speaking of government policies nobody talked about, let's talk about forced sterilization of Indigenous women. Between the 1930s and 1970s, thousands of Indigenous women were sterilized without informed consent. This happened in several provinces, but was particularly systematic in Alberta and British Columbia. Women would go to hospitals for other procedures, often childbirth, and would be sterilized without being told beforehand or without understanding what was being done to them. The justification was eugenics, the belief that certain groups were genetically inferior and shouldn't reproduce. Alberta had a eugenics board that approved sterilizations from 1928 to 1972. The board disproportionately targeted Indigenous peoples, Eastern European immigrants, and people with disabilities. Of the approximately 2,800 people sterilized under Alberta's program, a hugely disproportionate number were Indigenous. The practice continued even after the formal eugenics programs ended. There are documented cases of Indigenous women being pressured to agree to sterilization while in labor, in pain, and not fully understanding what they were consenting to. Some were told they would lose custody of their existing children if they didn't agree to sterilization. This happened in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Not ancient history. Within living memory, the forced sterilization of Indigenous women is genocide under the UN definition. It's deliberately preventing births within a group. It happened in Canada, it was government policy in some cases, and accepted medical practice in others. And it's barely mentioned in Canadian history education. The first formal inquiry into covert sterilization of Indigenous women didn't happen until 2015 in Saskatchewan. These aren't isolated incidents or rogue doctors. These were systematic practices that happened over decades with government knowledge and often government support. And they were hidden, erased from history, not talked about, because they don't fit the narrative of Canada as a progressive, tolerant nation. And speaking of narratives that don't fit reality, let's talk about Canada's environmental record. Canada likes to present itself as environmentally conscious. Clean air, pristine wilderness, careful stewardship of natural resources. The reality is that Canada has one of the worst environmental records of any developed nation. Canada's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are among the highest in the world. Canada has consistently missed climate targets. Canada subsidizes fossil fuel industries while claiming to fight climate change. The Alberta tar sands are one of the most environmentally destructive resource extraction projects on the planet. The process of extracting oil from tar sands requires enormous amounts of energy and water. It destroys boreal forest. It creates toxic tailings, ponds that leak into groundwater. Indigenous communities downstream have experienced increases in rare cancers and other health problems. The government's response has been to continue expansion while making vague promises about future reductions. Canada's forestry practices are often unsustainable. Old-growth forests are still being clear-cut. Logging companies operate on public land with minimal oversight. When environmental groups or Indigenous nations try to block destructive logging, they're portrayed as extremists blocking economic development. The Clayoquot Sound protests in British Columbia in 1993 saw over 800 people arrested for trying to stop clear-cutting of old-growth temperate rainforest. The logging continued. Canada's fisheries have been mismanaged to the point of collapse. The Atlantic cod fishery, which sustained communities for centuries, collapsed in the early 1990s due to overfishing. The government knew the stocks were declining. Scientists warned about the danger. The government ignored them and allowed overfishing to continue until the population crashed. The moratorium on cod fishing put tens of thousands of people out of work and destroyed coastal communities. The cod stocks still haven't recovered over 30 years later. The Pacific salmon fishery is in crisis. Wild salmon populations are declining dramatically. Fish farms, which are supposed to be sustainable aquaculture, are spreading diseases to wild fish. The government has been slow to regulate fish farms or protect wild populations. Indigenous communities that have depended on salmon for thousands of years are watching the fish disappear. Canada signed the Paris Climate Agreement and committed to reducing emissions. Canada has never met any of its climate targets. Emissions have increased since the Paris Agreement was signed. The federal government bought a pipeline to expand tar sands oil export capacity while claiming to take climate change seriously. That's not environmental leadership. That's greenwashing. The mythology is that Canada is a clean, green nation. The reality is that Canada exploits natural resources aggressively with minimal environmental protection. Canada's environmental record is bad, getting worse, and hidden behind rhetoric about sustainability and stewardship. And speaking of myths about Canadian virtue, let's talk about Canada's record on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For decades, Indigenous women and girls disappeared or were murdered at rates far higher than the general population. Families reported women missing, and police didn't investigate seriously. Bodies were found, and cases were closed without thorough investigation. The pattern was obvious to Indigenous communities, but ignored by authorities. The Highway of Tears in British Columbia is particularly notorious. Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert has been the site of numerous disappearances and murders of Indigenous women since the 1970s. Estimates vary, but at least 40 women have disappeared or been murdered along this highway. Many were hitchhiking because there was no reliable public transportation. The RCMP's response was to tell women not to hitchhike rather than to provide transportation or seriously investigate the cases. Nationally, Indigenous women and girls are killed at rates roughly 6 times higher than non-Indigenous women. When they go missing, police are less likely to investigate aggressively. Media coverage is minimal. Public attention is negligible. There's a term for this: missing white woman syndrome. When a white woman goes missing, it's national news. When an Indigenous woman goes missing, it's barely mentioned. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was established in 2016 and released its final report in 2019. The inquiry heard from families, survivors, and communities. It documented systemic failures by police, by government, by society. The report concluded that the violence against Indigenous women and girls amounts to genocide, not historical genocide like residential schools, ongoing genocide happening now. The report made 231 calls for justice, recommendations for how to address the crisis. The government's response has been minimal. Some recommendations have been partially implemented. Most have been ignored. Indigenous women continue to go missing and be murdered at disproportionate rates. The crisis continues. This isn't ancient history. This is happening now. And for most of Canadian history, it was invisible. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't discussed in media. It wasn't acknowledged by government. Indigenous communities were screaming about missing women and girls, and nobody was listening. That's not the behavior of a just society. That's the behavior of a society that doesn't value Indigenous lives. And speaking of things that reveal what Canada values, let's talk about economic inequality and the myth of Canadian prosperity. Canada is portrayed as a prosperous middle-class country where everyone has opportunities. The reality is that wealth inequality in Canada has been growing for decades. The richest Canadians have gotten much richer. The middle class has stagnated. Poverty persists despite economic growth. Indigenous peoples experience poverty at rates far higher than non-Indigenous Canadians. Many reserves lack clean drinking water. Housing is often substandard. Employment opportunities are limited. Educational outcomes are worse. Health outcomes are worse. Life expectancy is lower. These aren't natural conditions. These are the results of policy decisions and systemic discrimination. The myth is that Indigenous peoples receive special benefits from the government. The reality is that treaty obligations and government programs barely compensate for the massive disadvantages created by colonization, residential schools, and ongoing discrimination. The money spent on Indigenous programs is presented as generosity. It's actually inadequate compensation for stolen land and destroyed cultures. Racialized Canadians also experience economic inequality. The wage gap between white Canadians and racialized Canadians persists even when controlling for education and experience. Racialized Canadians are overrepresented in low-wage jobs and underrepresented in high-paying professions. The myth of Canadian multiculturalism suggests everyone has equal opportunities. The economic data shows otherwise. Women in Canada still earn less than men for equivalent work. The gender wage gap has narrowed over time but hasn't disappeared. Women are underrepresented in leadership positions in business and government. The myth is that Canada has achieved gender equality. The reality is that progress has been made, but significant. Inequality remains. The Canadian dream narrative, similar to the American dream, suggests that anyone can succeed through hard work. The reality is that your chances of success are heavily influenced by your family background, your race, your gender, where you were born. Social mobility in Canada is lower than the mythology suggests. If you're born poor, you're likely to stay poor. If you're born rich, you're likely to stay rich. And speaking of mythology around Canadian identity, let's talk about the two solitudes concept. This is the idea that Canada consists of two founding peoples, English and French, who live parallel lives without really understanding each other. It's taught as a description of Canadian reality and a challenge to be overcome. The two solitudes narrative completely erases Indigenous peoples. If Canada has two founding peoples, where does that leave the people who were here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived? It also erases other immigrant communities. What about the Chinese workers who built the railway? The Ukrainian settlers on the prairies? The Caribbean immigrants who came after World War II? The Vietnamese refugees? The Syrian refugees? The two solitudes is a colonial framework that treats French and English settlers as the only people who matter. It's embedded in Canadian political structures. Federal bilingualism serves English and French. Indigenous languages aren't official languages. Other immigrant languages aren't recognized officially. The very structure of Canadian federalism is built on the assumption that accommodating French and English Canada is the fundamental challenge. This framework has shaped Canadian politics. Quebec's place in Confederation has been endlessly debated. Constitutional negotiations have focused on French-English relations. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples' constitutional rights are treated as secondary. Immigration policy is debated in terms of how it affects French-English balance. The concerns of immigrant communities are marginalized. The two solitudes narrative made sense to a certain generation of Canadian politicians and intellectuals, but it was never accurate as a description of Canadian diversity, and it actively harms efforts to create a truly multicultural Canada by reinforcing the centrality of French and English identities at the expense of everyone else. And speaking of frameworks that don't reflect reality, let's talk about Canadian federalism and provincial rights. Canada is a federal system where power is divided between federal and provincial governments. The division of powers is supposed to be clear. The reality is that it's constantly contested and often dysfunctional. Healthcare is a provincial responsibility, but the federal government provides funding. This creates ongoing fights about whether the federal government is providing enough money and whether provinces are spending it properly. Every few years, there's a crisis about healthcare funding. The system lurches from crisis to crisis without ever being fixed. Education is provincial, which means there's no national curriculum. What students learn varies by province. Quebec's history curriculum is very different from Ontario's. Alberta teaches different science than British Columbia in some cases. This creates a patchwork of educational standards across the country. Natural resources are provincially controlled. This means provinces can develop resources with minimal federal oversight. It also means environmental regulations vary by province. Alberta can have much weaker environmental rules than British Columbia. Companies can shop for the province with the weakest regulations. The federal government has limited ability to enforce national standards. Provinces can ignore federal initiatives if they choose. Quebec opted out of various federal programs and received compensation to run their own programs instead. This asymmetrical federalism works, kind of, but it creates confusion and inconsistency. The myth is that Canadian federalism is a well-designed system that balances national and provincial interests. The reality is that it's a messy compromise that creates ongoing jurisdictional fights. Things don't get done because nobody's clearly responsible. Federal and provincial governments blame each other when things go wrong. And speaking of governments blaming each other, let's talk about the sponsorship scandal in the early 2000s. This was a Liberal government program ostensibly designed to promote Canadian unity in Quebec after the 1995 referendum. The program gave money to advertising agencies for sponsorships and events promoting Canada. Investigations revealed that much of the money was funneled to Liberal-friendly advertising firms with minimal work done in return. Money was paid for reports that were never written. Sponsorships went to events that barely happened. The program was essentially a slush fund to reward Liberal supporters and to funnel money back to the Liberal Party through illegal donations. The sponsorship scandal involved fraud, corruption, and misuse of public funds. The Gomery Commission investigated and found widespread wrongdoing. Several people were charged and convicted. The Liberal government fell. The scandal contributed to the Conservative victory in 2006. What's interesting about the sponsorship scandal is how it's remembered. It's taught as a corruption scandal that brought down a government. What's less emphasized is that it was a program supposedly about national unity that turned into a corrupt scheme to reward political allies. The people stealing public money claimed to be saving Canadian unity. They were just stealing. The scandal reinforced cynicism about government. It fed into the narrative that all politicians are corrupt. It damaged public trust. But it also revealed how government programs can be hijacked for partisan purposes. Money meant for public good can be diverted to private benefit with minimal oversight. And speaking of public good versus private benefit, let's talk about privatization in Canada. Since the 1980s, Canadian governments have sold off public assets to private companies. The myth is that privatization improves efficiency and reduces costs. The reality is mixed at best and often disastrous. The privatization of Air Canada in 1988 and 1989 turned a Crown corporation into a private company. The promise was better service and lower prices through competition. The reality is that Air Canada has near monopoly power on many routes. Service quality has declined. Prices haven't dropped. The main change is that profits go to shareholders instead of being retained by a public corporation. The privatization of highway maintenance in British Columbia in the 1980s led to deteriorating road conditions. Private companies cut maintenance to maximize profits. Roads weren't maintained properly. Snow removal was inadequate. The province eventually had to re-establish public control over highway maintenance because private companies weren't doing the job. Ontario privatized electricity generation and distribution through the creation of Hydro One. Prices increased. Service didn't improve. The CEO made millions in salary, while customers paid higher rates. The privatization benefited executives and shareholders, but not consumers. The pattern repeats across sectors and provinces. Public services are privatized with promises of efficiency. Costs go up. Service quality goes down. Profits are extracted. When things go badly wrong, the government has to step back in. But by then, public capacity has been lost, and rebuilding is difficult. The mythology around privatization is ideological. The belief that private sector is always more efficient than public sector. The reality is that some services work better as public goods. Healthcare, education, utilities. These things don't necessarily improve when privatized. Often they get worse. And speaking of ideology versus reality, let's talk about Canada's military spending and NATO commitments. Canada is a NATO member and has committed to spending 2% of GDP on defense. Canada has never met this commitment. Canadian military spending has been around 1 to 1.5% of GDP for decades. This means Canada free rides on the security provided by other NATO members, particularly the United States. The myth is that Canada is a reliable ally that contributes to collective defense. The reality is that Canada underfunds its military and relies on others to pick up the slack. Canadian equipment is often outdated. Canadian forces are stretched thin. When Canada commits to military operations, it sometimes struggles to deploy and sustain forces. This underfunding has consequences. The Canadian Navy has trouble keeping ships operational. The Air Force flies elderly aircraft. The Army has recruitment and retention problems. When crises occur, Canada's ability to respond is limited by inadequate resources. Canadian politicians love to talk about supporting the troops. They attend commemorations, they praise military service, but they don't fund the military adequately. They expect Canadian forces to do more with less. They make commitments that strain military capacity. And they blame the military when things go wrong rather than acknowledging that underfunding is a political choice. And speaking of political choices with long-term consequences, let's talk about infrastructure deficit. For decades, Canadian governments at all levels have deferred infrastructure maintenance and investment. Roads, bridges, water systems, public transit, all have been allowed to deteriorate. The bill for fixing everything is now enormous. The reason for this is political incentives. Building new infrastructure gets you votes and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Maintaining existing infrastructure is boring. It doesn't generate photo opportunities, so politicians fund new projects and defer maintenance. Over time, this creates a massive backlog of repairs and replacements. Water systems in many Canadian cities are old and failing. Pipes leak. Treatment plants are outdated. Some cities lose enormous amounts of water to leaks. The cost of replacing aging water infrastructure runs into hundreds of billions of dollars nationally. Public transit in most Canadian cities outside Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver is inadequate. Cities have sprawled without building transit to serve sprawling suburbs. Traffic congestion is terrible. Commutes are long. Air quality suffers. But building transit is expensive and politically difficult, so it doesn't happen. The infrastructure deficit is the result of decades of short-term thinking. The bill keeps growing. Eventually, it will have to be paid. But every year that passes without adequate investment makes the problem worse and the eventual cost higher. And speaking of costs growing over time, let's talk about housing affordability in Canada. Canadian housing prices, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver, have increased far faster than incomes. Home ownership has become unaffordable for many young Canadians. Renting is expensive. Housing is consuming a larger and larger share of household income. The causes are complex. Speculation, foreign investment, low interest rates, restrictive zoning, insufficient construction of new housing. But the result is clear. A generation of Canadians is being priced out of housing markets. The Canadian dream of home ownership is increasingly out of reach. Government response has been inadequate. Some measures to cool markets, some programs to help first-time buyers, but nothing that addresses the fundamental supply problem. Existing homeowners benefit from rising prices. They vote against policies that might reduce their home values. Politicians cater to homeowners because they vote. young people who can't afford homes, are underrepresented politically. The housing crisis reveals distributional conflict. Older Canadians who bought homes when they were affordable have benefited from rising prices. Younger Canadians face a much more difficult housing market. Policies that would make housing more affordable would reduce the wealth of existing homeowners. That creates political resistance. The myth is that Canada is a fair meritocracy where housing is accessible. The reality is that Canada is developing a class divide based on home ownership. Those who own property accumulate wealth. Those who rent fall further behind. And government policy favors the wealthy homeowners over young people trying to enter the market. And speaking of government policy favoring certain groups, let's talk about pipelines and Indigenous rights. Canada has been embroiled in pipeline controversies for years. The Keystone XL pipeline, the Trans Mountain pipeline, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, all have faced opposition from Indigenous nations whose territories the pipelines cross. The pattern is consistent. Companies want to build pipelines. Indigenous nations say no. The government approves the pipelines anyway. Protests happen. Police enforce court injunctions. The justification is always economic development and national interest. The government claims it consulted with Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities say consultation wasn't meaningful. The government approved the project before consultation was complete. The decision was predetermined. Consultation was a box to check, not a genuine process. The Constitution Act of 1982 recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights. The Supreme Court has ruled that governments have a duty to consult with Indigenous peoples and, where appropriate, accommodate their interests when decisions might affect their rights. But consultation doesn't mean consent. The government can consult, hear objections, and approve the project anyway. This creates a situation where Indigenous nations have constitutional rights that are recognized in theory but ignored in practice. When they assert their rights, they're portrayed as blocking development and hurting the economy. When they protest or physically block pipelines, they're arrested and charged. The Trans Mountain pipeline is particularly instructive. The federal government bought the pipeline from Kinder Morgan for $4.5 billion in 2018. The government, which is supposed to regulate pipelines and protect Indigenous rights, became the pipeline owner. This created an obvious conflict of interest. The government, that's supposed to objectively assess whether the pipeline should be built, is the pipeline's owner, with a financial interest in seeing it completed. Opposition from Indigenous nations and environmental groups has been intense. Court challenges have delayed construction. Protests have blocked work. The government's response has been to push forward. Regardless, the final cost of the pipeline is expected to be over $30 billion, far more than the original estimate. Taxpayers are funding a pipeline that many Canadians oppose and that violates Indigenous rights. The mythology is that Canada respects Indigenous rights and takes environmental concerns seriously. The reality is that when Indigenous rights conflict with resource development wins. When environmental protection conflicts with economic interests win. The government talks about reconciliation and climate action. Then it buys pipelines and arrests Indigenous protesters. And speaking of reconciliation being more talk than action, let's talk about the truth and reconciliation. Commission's 94 calls to action. The TRC released its final report in 2015 with 94 specific recommendations for how Canada could address the legacy of residential schools and move toward reconciliation. These weren't vague suggestions. They were concrete actions governments, institutions, and society could take. As of 2024, many calls to action remain incomplete or barely started. Some have been completed, but progress on others has been minimal. The federal government created a National Council for Reconciliation to track progress. The scorecard isn't good. Governments committed to reconciliation. Then they did the easy things and ignored the hard ones. Call to Action 3 asked for the creation of a National Council for Aboriginal Early Childhood Education. Not completed. Call to Action 7 asked for legislation to create a National Council on Aboriginal Health. Not completed. Call to Action 12 asked for the creation of an Aboriginal Languages Commissioner. This one was completed, years late. The calls to action that require significant funding or giving up government power are the ones that stall. Calls that require symbolic gestures or creating committees get done. Calls that would transfer real power or resources to Indigenous peoples get ignored or delayed indefinitely. This pattern reveals what reconciliation means to Canadian governments. It means apologizing. It means acknowledging past wrongs. It means creating commissions and councils. It doesn't mean giving land back. It doesn't mean recognizing Indigenous sovereignty. It doesn't mean fundamentally changing the relationship between Canada and Indigenous nations. Reconciliation has become a buzzword that makes Canadians feel good without requiring uncomfortable change. Governments can talk about reconciliation while continuing to violate Indigenous rights. Institutions can have land acknowledgements while maintaining colonial structures. Individuals can wear orange shirts on Truth and Reconciliation Day while supporting policies that harm Indigenous communities. The mythology is that Canada is on a path toward reconciliation. The reality is that reconciliation requires more than acknowledgement and apology. It requires returning land and power, and Canada isn't willing to do that. And speaking of things Canada isn't willing to do, let's talk about Arctic sovereignty. Canada claims the Arctic as Canadian territory. The government talks about defending Canadian sovereignty in the north. The reality is that Canada has limited ability to patrol or control the Arctic. Climate change is opening up the Northwest Passage. Other countries, particularly Russia and China, are interested in Arctic resources and shipping routes. Canada's military presence in the Arctic is minimal. The Canadian Rangers, a reserve force of local residents, provide most of the military presence. They're lightly equipped and trained. They couldn't defend against any serious incursion. The Canadian Navy doesn't have icebreakers capable of year-round Arctic operations. The Canadian Air Force patrols occasionally, but doesn't have permanent Arctic bases. The mythology is that Canada is an Arctic nation with strong Arctic presence. The reality is that Canada makes sovereignty, claims it can enforce. If Russia or China decided to challenge Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, Canada couldn't do much about it. Canada would rely on the United States to back up its claims. This is particularly relevant with climate change making Arctic resources more accessible. There's oil, gas, and minerals in the Arctic. Shipping through the Northwest Passage could become viable year-round. Other countries are investing in Arctic capabilities. Canada is making speeches about sovereignty without investing in the capabilities to back them up. And speaking of speeches without action, let's talk about Canada's international reputation versus reality. Canada is seen internationally as a progressive, peacekeeping, multicultural nation. Canadians benefit from this reputation when traveling. The Canadian flag on a backpack signals that you're not American, that you're one of the good guys. This reputation is largely undeserved. Canada's carbon emissions per capita are terrible. Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples is appalling. Canada's arms sales to Saudi Arabia continued even as Saudi Arabia bombed Yemen. Canada talks about human rights while selling weapons to authoritarian regimes. Canada talks about climate action while expanding fossil fuel production. The international reputation is based partly on comparison to the United States. Canada has universal health care. America doesn't. Canada has stricter gun control. America doesn't. Canada didn't invade Iraq in 2003. America did. These differences create a perception that Canada is fundamentally different and better than America. But the differences are smaller than Canadians like to think. Canada participated in the war in Afghanistan. Canada has its own history of slavery, though it's less acknowledged. Canada had residential schools. Canada interned Japanese Canadians. Canada has police violence against Indigenous peoples and Black Canadians. Canada is dealing with far-right extremism and hate groups. The mythology allows Canadians to feel superior without examining their own country's problems. It's easier to criticize American racism than to address Canadian racism. It's easier to mock American healthcare than to fix Canadian healthcare's problems. It's easier to feel smug about Canadian multiculturalism than to address ongoing discrimination. The international reputation is an asset. It makes diplomacy easier. It makes trade agreements smoother. But it's also a shield that prevents accountability. Canada can do terrible things and maintain a reputation as the good guys because people assume Canada is better than it actually is. And speaking of assumptions versus reality, let's talk about Canadian innovation and technology. Canada is sometimes portrayed as a leader in innovation. The truth is more complicated. Canada produces talented researchers and engineers, but Canada struggles to commercialize research and build technology companies. Canadian universities do good research. Canadian researchers win awards and publish important papers. But the research often gets commercialized in other countries. Researchers move to the United States or elsewhere where funding and opportunities are better. Companies license Canadian research and build products in other countries. Canada has produced some successful technology companies. Shopify, OpenText, BlackBerry in its heyday. But Canada hasn't created companies at the scale of American tech giants. There's no Canadian Google or Facebook or Amazon. Canadian tech sector exists but is much smaller than it could be. The reasons are complex. Canada's market is smaller. Canada's venture capital scene is less developed. Top talent often moves to Silicon Valley or other tech hubs. Canadian companies get acquired by American companies before growing too large. Government support for innovation exists, but is bureaucratic and slow. The mythology is that Canada is an innovation leader. The reality is that Canada has innovation inputs, like education and research, but struggles with innovation outputs like successful companies and commercialized products. Canada trains talented people who often build their careers elsewhere. And speaking of building careers elsewhere, let's talk about brain drain. Canada loses talented people to other countries, particularly the United States. Doctors, engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, they often leave Canada for better opportunities abroad. This represents a loss of talent and of the investment Canada made in educating these people. The brain drain is particularly severe in medicine. Canadian medical schools train doctors with public funding. Then those doctors move to the United States, where salaries are higher. Canada pays to train doctors for the American healthcare system. This is economically irrational, but it happens because Canada can't or won't match American salaries. Similar patterns exist in other fields. Canadian tech workers move to Silicon Valley. Canadian finance professionals move to Wall Street. Canadian academics move to American universities. The talent flows in one direction, from Canada to countries with better opportunities and higher pay. Canada also experiences reverse brain drain, where immigrants with advanced degrees and professional qualifications work in jobs below their skill level, because Canadian professional organizations don't recognize foreign credentials. A doctor from India drives a taxi in Toronto because getting Canadian medical certification is prohibitively difficult. An engineer from China works in a warehouse because their engineering degree isn't recognized. This is economically wasteful and personally devastating. Canada attracts educated immigrants, then fails to utilize their skills. The mythology is that Canada is a land of opportunity for immigrants. The reality is that many immigrants face credential barriers and discrimination that prevent them from working in their professions. And speaking of immigration myths, let's talk about Canada's points-based immigration system. This system is held up as a model. Immigrants are selected based on education, work experience, language skills, and other factors. The idea is to attract immigrants who will contribute economically. In practice, the system has problems. The system favors certain types of immigrants while excluding others. It's easier to immigrate if you're young, educated, speak English or French, and have professional work experience. It's much harder if you're older, less educated, don't speak official languages, or work in trades or manual labor. This creates a bias towards certain countries and against others. The system also doesn't guarantee economic success. Many immigrants with high points struggle to find work in their fields. They face credential recognition problems, discrimination, and lack of Canadian work experience. The point system gets them into Canada, but doesn't ensure they'll succeed once here. Family reunification, which allows Canadians to sponsor relatives to immigrate, has long backlogs. People wait years to be reunited with spouses, parents, or children. The government processes economic immigrants faster than family class immigrants because economic immigrants are seen as more valuable. This treats families as less important than economic contribution. Refugee acceptance is even more problematic. Canada accepts refugees, but the process is slow and the numbers are limited. During refugee crises, Canada's response is often inadequate. The Syrian refugee crisis saw Canada eventually accept significant numbers, but only after public pressure. The process was slow and bureaucratic. Refugees waited in camps for years while Canada processed applications. The mythology is that Canada is welcoming to immigrants and refugees. The reality is that Canada's immigration system is selective, bureaucratic, and often fails to live up to its promises. Canada wants immigrants who will economically benefit Canada. Immigrants who need help or don't fit the economic criteria face barriers. And speaking of selective welcome, let's talk about Canada's history with different immigrant groups. We've already covered Chinese exclusion and Japanese internment, but discrimination extended to many other groups. South Asian immigrants faced restrictions. Jewish refugees were turned away. Black immigration was discouraged through various means. The Kamagata Maru has been mentioned, but it's worth emphasizing. In 1914, Canada turned away 376 passengers, mostly Sikhs, who were British subjects with every legal right to enter Canada. They were rejected purely because of race. This wasn't some minor bureaucratic error. This was official policy. Immigration from the Caribbean was restricted for decades. The government wanted white immigrants from Britain and Western Europe. When labor shortages required looking elsewhere, the government reluctantly accepted other immigrants, but often with restrictions. Domestic workers from the Caribbean could immigrate but faced exploitative conditions. They worked in Canadian homes with minimal rights and little ability to change jobs or bring families. The pattern across Canadian immigration history is preference for white, European, preferably British immigrants, Everyone else faced barriers, discrimination, or outright exclusion. The point system introduced in the 1960s was a significant improvement because it removed explicitly racial criteria, but it didn't eliminate discrimination or create equal opportunity. And speaking of discrimination that persists, let's talk about anti-Black racism in Canada. Black Canadians have been in Canada for centuries. Black loyalists came to Nova Scotia after the American Revolution. Black refugees came during the War of 1812. The Underground Railroad brought escaped slaves to Canada before the American Civil War. Black Canadians have deep roots in the country. Despite this history, Black Canadians face ongoing discrimination. They're overrepresented in poverty statistics. They face discrimination in employment, housing, and education. They experience police violence and racial profiling. They're stopped by police more often than white Canadians. They're more likely to be arrested, charged, and incarcerated. The mythology is that Canada doesn't have the same racial problems as the United States. Canada didn't have slavery to the same extent. Canada was the end of the Underground Railroad where escaped slaves found freedom. Therefore, Canada is less racist. This is false. Canada had slavery. It was never as large scale as American slavery, but it existed. Indigenous peoples were enslaved. Africans were enslaved. Slavery was legal in New France and British North America. It wasn't abolished until the early 1800s, and even then enforcement was inconsistent. After slavery ended, segregation and discrimination continued. Black Canadians faced segregated schools, restricted employment opportunities, and social discrimination. This history is less well known than American history, partly because Black Canadian population was smaller and partly because Canadian mythology doesn't acknowledge it. The result is that many Canadians are surprised when Black Canadians talk about experiencing racism. The response is often denial. That doesn't happen in Canada. We're not like America. This denial prevents addressing the actual racism that exists. And speaking of denial, let's talk about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, enacted in 1982, is supposed to protect fundamental rights and freedoms. It's taught as a cornerstone of Canadian democracy. It does provide important protections, but it also has a massive loophole called the Notwithstanding Clause. Section 33 of the Charter allows federal or provincial governments to pass laws that operate notwithstanding certain charter rights. The government can say this law violates charter rights, but we're passing it anyway. The law expires after 5 years unless renewed. This was included as a compromise to get provinces to agree to the charter. The Notwithstanding Clause was supposed to be rarely used, only in extraordinary circumstances. In practice, some provinces use it regularly. Quebec has used it multiple times, most notably for language laws. Other provinces have threatened to use it or actually used it for various purposes. In 2018, Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened to use the Notwithstanding Clause to pass a law reducing the size of Toronto City Council in the middle of an election. He eventually didn't need to because a court ruling went his way. But the willingness to override charter rights for something as minor as municipal politics was alarming. The Notwithstanding Clause means charter rights aren't absolute. They can be overridden by governments for political reasons. The charter protects rights unless the government decides it doesn't want to. That's not really protection. That's conditional rights that exist at the government's pleasure. And speaking of conditional rights, let's talk about freedom of expression in Canada. The Charter protects fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression. But this freedom has limits. Hate speech is illegal. Obscenity is illegal. Defamation laws restrict speech. These limitations are arguably necessary, but they also mean Canadian freedom of expression is more limited than American freedom of expression. Canada has hate speech laws that criminalize public incitement of hatred against identifiable groups. This sounds reasonable. Hate speech is harmful, and societies should be able to restrict it. But determining what constitutes hate speech is complicated. The line between offensive speech and illegal hate speech isn't always clear. Canadian libel laws favor plaintiffs more than American laws do. In the United States, public figures must prove actual malice to win libel suits. In Canada, the standard is lower. This makes it easier to sue for defamation in Canada. It also creates a chilling effect on journalism and criticism. Canada also has laws restricting political advertising during elections. Third parties can't spend unlimited money on political ads. This prevents wealthy individuals or groups from dominating political discourse through spending. But it also restricts political speech in ways that would violate the First Amendment in the United States. These restrictions on expression are often defended as necessary to protect other values, like equality, dignity, and fair elections. That's a reasonable argument, but it means freedom of expression in Canada is balanced against other values. It's not absolute. Whether that's good or bad depends on your perspective, but it's different from the mythology that suggests Canada has robust freedom of expression. And speaking of mythology versus reality, let's talk about hockey and Canadian identity. Hockey is central to how Canadians see themselves. It's Canada's game. Every Canadian kid supposedly learns to skate and play hockey. Canada produces the best hockey players in the world. Olympic hockey. Gold medals are national moments of unity, except not every Canadian cares about hockey. The hockey obsession is particularly strong among white, English-speaking Canadians. It's less central to Francophone culture, though Quebec has its own strong hockey tradition. It's often alien to immigrant communities who grew up with soccer or cricket or other sports. The hockey mythology also erases women's hockey. When Canadians talk about hockey, they usually mean men's hockey. Women's hockey gets less attention, less funding, less media coverage. Canadian women's hockey teams are very successful internationally, but they're treated as secondary to men's teams. The mythology that hockey is Canada's game for all Canadians excludes people who don't play or watch hockey. It creates pressure to conform to a particular vision of Canadian identity. If you don't like hockey, are you really Canadian? This is gatekeeping identity based on sports preference. Hockey also has ongoing problems with racism, homophobia, and toxic culture. Junior hockey has had abuse scandals. Professional hockey has been slow to address racism and to welcome LGBTQ players. The hockey culture that's held up as quintessentially Canadian has serious problems. And speaking of quintessentially Canadian things with problems, let's talk about the CBC. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is the public broadcaster funded by government. It's supposed to provide Canadian content and serve all Canadians. In reality, the CBC is controversial and faces ongoing criticism from different directions. Conservatives accuse the CBC of liberal bias. They want to defund or privatize it. They argue taxpayers shouldn't fund a broadcaster that many people don't watch or listen to. Liberals defend the CBC as essential for Canadian culture and democracy. They argue public broadcasting serves communities that commercial broadcasters ignore. The CBC does produce Canadian content that wouldn't otherwise exist. It broadcasts in Indigenous languages. It covers remote communities. It produces Canadian drama, comedy, and news. But it also competes with private broadcasters for audiences and advertising, which creates resentment from commercial media. The CBC's funding model is problematic. It receives government funding but also sells advertising. This creates incentives to chase ratings rather than serve public interest. It also makes the CBC dependent on government funding decisions, which creates pressure to avoid offending the government. The result is that the CBC satisfies nobody completely. Conservatives think it's biased and wasteful. Progressives think it's too cautious and commercial. Indigenous peoples and other minorities think it doesn't serve them adequately. The CBC exists in a constant state of defending its existence and relevance. And speaking of defending relevance, let's talk about Canadian culture and the ongoing anxiety about American cultural dominance. Canada has implemented various policies to protect and promote Canadian culture. CanCon regulations require broadcasters to air minimum percentages of Canadian content. Funding programs support Canadian artists, filmmakers, and musicians. These policies have had some success. Canada has produced internationally successful artists, authors, and filmmakers. But the anxiety about American cultural influence persists. Most movies Canadians watch are American. Most TV shows are American. Most music on the radio is American or international. Canadian content exists but competes in a marketplace dominated by American entertainment. The question is whether this matters. Does it matter if Canadians consume American culture as long as some Canadian culture exists? Or is cultural sovereignty important enough to justify government intervention? There's no consensus. Some argue cultural protectionism is necessary. Others argue the market should decide what people watch and listen to. What's clear is that Canadian identity is partially defined in opposition to American identity. Canadians define themselves as not American. But when Canadian culture is heavily influenced by American culture, what does it mean to be not American? This creates an identity crisis that Canadian cultural policy tries to address but can't fully solve. And speaking of identity crises, let's talk about what Canada actually is. Is Canada a bilingual country? Only if you speak English or French. Is Canada multicultural? Yes, but with ongoing discrimination. Is Canada a democracy? Yes, but with significant flaws. Is Canada a wealthy country? Yes, but with significant poverty. Is Canada independent? Mostly, but still tied to Britain constitutionally and to America economically. Canada is contradictory. It's a nation built on Indigenous land that hasn't reconciled with Indigenous peoples. It's a country that prides itself on multiculturalism but has a history of racist exclusion. It's a place that values equality but tolerates significant inequality. It's a democracy that concentrates power in the Prime Minister's office. It's wealthy but struggles with crumbling infrastructure and inadequate public services. The lies taught in Canadian history classes aren't usually outright fabrications. They're omissions, minimizations, and misleading framings. They're teaching Confederation without mentioning it wasn't democratic. They're teaching about the War of 1812 without clarifying who actually fought it. They're teaching about Canadian tolerance without discussing Chinese exclusion, Japanese internment, or turning away Jewish refugees. They're teaching about Canadian achievements without acknowledging ongoing failures. The result is a population that believes myths about their country. Canadians think Canada is better than it is. This prevents honest assessment of problems and blocks efforts to fix them. If you believe Canada is already tolerant and fair, why would you support policies to address discrimination? If you believe Canada respects Indigenous rights, why would you question pipeline approvals? If you believe Canadian democracy is working well, why would you support democratic reforms? The comfortable lies serve power. They make Canadians feel good about their country without requiring change. They create a national identity based on mythology rather than reality. And they ensure that the next generation will be taught the same lies, continuing the cycle. Breaking this cycle requires teaching honest history. It requires acknowledging that Canada's founding wasn't democratic, that colonization wasn't peaceful, that tolerance is recent and incomplete, that prosperity isn't equally shared, that environmental stewardship is rhetoric, not reality. It requires admitting that Canada has serious ongoing problems rather than pretending they're historical mistakes that have been corrected. This isn't about hating Canada or claiming everything is terrible. Canada has real achievements. Canadian society has improved in many ways. Rights have expanded. Opportunities have increased. Standards of living have risen. But acknowledging improvements doesn't require ignoring ongoing problems or whitewashing history. The question is whether Canadians can handle the truth about their country, whether they can look honestly at Canadian history and Canadian present and work towards something better, or whether they'll continue clinging to comfortable myths that make them feel good while preventing meaningful change. The lies they taught you in Canadian history class aren't harmless. They shape how you see the country, what problems you recognize, what solutions you support. They matter, and it's time to stop believing them. So here you are at the end of this journey through the myths, omissions, and outright lies that pass for Canadian history education. You've learned that the country you thought you knew was built on stories designed to make you feel good rather than help you understand reality. That peaceful Canada was often violent. That tolerant Canada was frequently exclusionary. That democratic Canada concentrated power and denied rights. That progressive Canada lagged behind on justice. None of this erases Canada's real achievements or means the country is irredeemable. It just means Canada is complicated, flawed, and human like everywhere else. The mythology served to create national unity and pride, but pride built on lies is fragile. Real pride comes from honest reckoning with truth and commitment to justice. So sleep well, knowing what you now know, and wake up ready to build the Canada that should exist rather than defend the Canada of mythology.